Welcome to Greenomics, a podcast from Oxford Economics where we delve into the complex relationships between climate, nature, and our global economy. I'm your host, Sarah Nelson, in the Economics and Sustainability team here at Oxford Economics, and together we'll be navigating the changing landscape of the green transition. Each month, we will be joined by a panel of experts to discuss one aspect of sustainability and unpack what it means for businesses in today's economy. 2023 smashed a lot of climate records. We had the highest global average temperature since records began at almost 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages. We also had the biggest ever COP, with some notable progress made, and saw lots of initiatives, policies, and regulations announced and enacted. Now it's time to look towards 2024. I spoke to three guests about the sustainability trends to keep up with this year across politics, technology, and business. The first theme that we're going to look at today is politics. 2024 brings a huge number of elections and with it, a high potential for political change. Joining me to discuss what that might mean for sustainability is Beatrice Tanjanco. Bea is a senior economist in our climate scenarios and modeling team and has a finger on the pulse of how politics might affect our climate trajectory. Bea, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me back.
So a couple of elections coming up this year. What do you think will be the most impactful elections in 2024?
Yeah, it's a big year. So we have large emitters like the US, countries in the global north like the UK and the EU, and countries in the south like India and Indonesia. So in the US, Donald Trump is the Republican frontrunner. And if he wins a second term, there would be significant shifts in policies. The United States would probably exit the Paris Agreement again, and Trump might try to roll back environmental regulations that the Biden administration issued. And Congress might also cut off climate spending in last year's Inflation Reduction Act. However, the odds are that the tax credits for the clean energy investment in the IRA would remain because these are quite difficult to end or scale back. Now, if Biden wins, he would likely support climate initiatives, but how successful he would be in passing these initiatives would depend on who controls the House and the Senate. Now, across the pond, we have the UK, who might have an election this year. And there's a bit of a gap between the Conservatives, who are likely to dial back climate policies, and Labour, who still have plans to invest in a large sum of green projects. So Labour still intends to fully decarbonize electricity by 2030. So this would still require some investment. Now, we also have the EU, and voters will head to the poll in June to elect the next EU Parliament. And this would determine EU climate policy in the next 5 years. The last few years saw climate ambition increase, and the next years will be all about seeing this through and perhaps raising ambition. So, for example, this would be like deciding what the 2040 emissions target should be. We also have important elections in India and Indonesia, and these are both large economies, big populations, and top emitters. India is actually one of the top emitters in the world following the US and China. But in India, elections are probably not going to change climate policy because we expect the BJP and Modi government to continue. Now, even though the contesting parties haven't released a formal stance, climate policies might not actually be top of mind for India because at their development level, there are a lot of other issues to talk about. So climate might actually take a backseat here. In Indonesia, which is another big one, particularly with emissions from land use and agriculture. Fortunately, all candidates in the country for presidency have vowed to push for more progress in tackling the climate crisis. So they generally believe the country should shift away from fossil fuels, which is really good. On a whole, climate might necessarily be the biggest concern for all elections, but it's entered most conversations. It will have a big impact on climate policy and the way forward.
So, are there any of those elections that you mentioned that you're particularly concerned about from a climate perspective?
Yeah, so from all of these elections, the most high stakes one might be the US election. It's just that the dividing lines on climate are simply bigger in the US. And they're also the world's second biggest polluter, and there's a big chance many of the steps forward might be reversed. And this would not be good for morale or for getting things done. And if you compare that with the UK, who might go into an election, while the Conservatives are thinking of dialing back ambition, the direction of travel is still the same, and the country still hopes to reach net zero. So there's a big difference. So a good caveat to note is that these elections are not that good at predicting what will happen in climate policy. So for example, in the Brazil election of Lula da Silva, where he won over Bolsonaro, whose term weakened environmental protection policies, Lula's win signaled a change in direction. But so far, they've really struggled to go strong on climate, and it looks like they'll be going into the oil business. And on the other hand, people were worried that in Argentina, they elected a candidate who was skeptical on climate, but he introduced a cap and trade system this year. So it's really, the elections really don't necessarily signal the direction of climate policy would take, but it's always like, it'll always be like a nice surprise.
So, I mean, like you say, it's hard to predict, but how important is this year and these elections for our net zero goals?
Well, these elections will determine some of the world's most powerful leaders in the next 5 to 6 years, depending on the term. And these years are crucial because within that time span, we approach 2030. And 2030 and 2050 are important years in our climate calendar, so to speak, because we expect the carbon budget to run out around that time. So we need leaders with the same sense of urgency as we do. Now, these elections are also important because some of the most important work we do in our fight against climate change will be done at the national level. So this means getting better at implementing commitments. So the COPs are there to provide direction, but the real work begins at home. Now, if we have say, a climate denier leading one of the biggest economies with the biggest source of emissions, then it would be difficult to reach our collective goal. And I guess another way politics influence climate action is that it's all about consistency in the messaging. So many of the investments we need for climate are long-term investments. They have a long-term investment horizon. So ideally, for this to happen, policies need to be stable. And if we don't want a lot of uncertainty in terms of the business environment. So for example, we don't want subsidies and tax breaks to suddenly reverse. If a car manufacturer invests in developing EVs, they don't want the subsidies that make these EVs more competitive to go away. So electing members of government to support climate ambitions reduces kind of uncertainty, and it can help with the transition.
And what about international cooperation?
Well, it's important that we work together because we work together, we get things done faster. International cooperation is difficult when everyone's interests are different and they do not align, let alone they're contrary to one another. So if we elect governments that do not believe in this cause, it'll be difficult to like raise our ambition, and it might even set us back. But being aligned in our collective goals is important because we keep each other in check. So the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions, are self-determined goals, but it's the pressure from our peers that keep us in line. So it's like other countries act to serve as a check against other countries. So it's good that we're all thinking the same thing. And another reason why international cooperation is important to do is for climate finance. So we need everyone to mobilize the funds we need for the transition, particularly to help developing countries. The financing that we have so far is limited, and we need to basically pool our resources to make sure that it's used efficiently and effectively. We need public and private capital to move towards greener projects, and we need the larger and wealthier economies to contribute and to buy in, and we need to incentivize investment in the necessary sectors. But in general, the fight against climate change is, I consider it a group effort. So emissions in one country is the same as emissions in another country. It all goes to the same place. It all pulls together. So this is a global problem, and we have a shared global responsibility to answer it. And it will definitely need a global effort.
And presumably like-minded global leaders.
Exactly.
Well, quite a year ahead, and looking forward to checking in at the end of the year to see how that's all gone. Thank you very much for joining me, Bear. It's been really interesting to talk.
Thanks.
Our second theme today is technology. Low carbon technologies will be critical for reaching net zero and rightly get a lot of attention as a result. But some of the most touted technologies remain elusive. I'm joined today by Dr. Chris Battaille to find out where the biggest progress might be made in 2024. Chris is an expert in the technologies and policies for achieving sustainable energy systems. He leads research with the Deep Decarbonisation Pathways Project at Simon Fraser and Columbia Universities and was the lead author on the most recent IPCC assessment report. Chris, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
So, as I mentioned, a lot of the decarbonisation technologies are headline grabbing. I'm thinking electric vehicles, wind turbines, carbon capture and storage. But a big chunk of the emissions reduction will come in the less sexy heavy industries like cement and steel. Chris, I believe this is your area of expertise. So, what are the technologies that show the greatest promise for decarbonising heavy industries?
That's a great question. About a 30% of global CO2 emissions come from heavy industries. So that's steel, cement, chemicals, and other heat. All three of those have, right up front, if we're a little bit more careful about how we use them, we use about 20 to 30% of more than we really should have, all 30, if we just think about those in the initial design. So that's the kind of first 20, 30% we look for. But each of them also has a fairly simple option. With steel, it's just using doing more secondary recycled steel. And that means more carefully sorting the scrap we have, putting a little extra fresh iron in with it, and then making as much steel as we can in electric arc furnaces. But beyond that, we get into much, much more exotic technologies. We have a couple of commercial options today. It's a technology developed in the 1970s called direct reduced iron. It requires, the way it's done today is we use methane or coal to create a syngas of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. The hydrogen takes away most of the oxygen in iron ore, leaving the elemental iron, which is where most of the emissions come from. And then the carbon monoxide provides much of the heat, but there are options to do entirely hydrogen-based DRI making. And that's the pathway most of the European steel makers are on right now. We've talked about applying CCS to steel for about 30 or 40 years. It hasn't gone anywhere. After DRI, we're probably looking at electrolysis technologies where we directly use electricity to take oxygen off of iron ore, leaving elemental iron. There's several technologies to do this, several companies doing this on both sides of the Atlantic and in China. And I think one of them is going to surprise us sooner or later. They managed to get to a pilot scale and then to a commercial scale. Cement, again, there are cheap options. We can eliminate about half the emissions by substituting clinker is the stuff it's the main component of cement, which holds together sand and concrete, which is the glue that holds concrete together. Think of Rice Krispie squares where the marshmallows hold the Rice Krispies together. Most of the emissions are in the cement and they're in the clinker making, and we can substitute about half that clinker with ground limestone and what we call calcined clays, and that could cut emissions in half by 2030. Using it meets building codes today, but we just have to build the equipment and find the clays and what have you. After that, you start needing carbon capture and storage on the back end. We've got a couple of plants. There's one should be finished in Norway this year, 60% capture. There's a couple that are at much higher capture rates that should be done by about 2025, 2026. They double the cost of making clinker, but they only add a couple of percent to the concrete and the cost of making a building. And that's something that needs to move quicker. In the wings, we have more exotic technologies to make cement. So there's Sublime that uses electricity to make the key mineral that we need, and Brimstone, which uses acid leaching to get out the minerals we need to make cement. And those two are probably the most public-facing technology companies right now, but there are a couple of European and I think Asian companies working on this as well. In 2023, one of the things that kind of jumped out and surprised everyone is we thought that lower temperature heat was going to be really expensive. So steam for food processing, textiles, what have you. But a couple of companies, Antora and I believe Rondo in the US, and I think there are other companies as well, they just basically use bricks, ceramic bricks, and you heat them with excess solar and wind electricity when it's available, and then you run a heat transfer fluid through them to get the heat out, and that gives you as much steam and often the higher temperatures that you need to do chemistry and what have you. So those are two things that we're watching pretty carefully. Probably the sector that's going to be hardest is chemicals. There are 7 big feedstock chemicals that that are the subcomponents for making over 100,000 different chemicals. They're, in most societies only need so much steel, only need so much cement, only need so much heat. But what we don't seem to satiate on is chemicals, especially plastics. We just use more and more of it. The key to doing that is to decarbonize the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen that goes into those plastics. But we're a bit of a ways away from that, and it's going to be quite expensive to do it. We know how to do it in the lab, but we don't know how to do it commercially. So if someone's got some bright ideas out there about how to make ethylene at room temperature with non-toxic materials, they could probably build a business out of that.
I think one of the really interesting things about what you've just said is that there's the sort of technological innovation in these sectors seem to be a combination of the exotic technologies and the kind of repurposed technologies from other sectors and historical contexts, which I think is fascinating. Are there any technologies or particular industries or subsectors that you think are on the cusp of major progress in 2024?
I really hope that the heat batteries come along in 2024. We see those heading into the marketplace because over 30% of our industrial heat needs is, roughly about 100 degrees Celsius just for steam, a little bit above that, and they're perfect for that. So if we started seeing those penetrate the market, that could really make our lives simpler using, off-peak electricity. I really hope we see CCS on cement plants this year operating. I hope with steel, we want to see some final investment decisions on more primary facilities. I'd love to see Boston Metals in the States actually get its first, pilot plant off the ground in Brazil. Those are the things I'm looking for, but I'm always happy to see upside surprises.
Well, we will check back with you in December to see how your predictions have panned out. So no pressure. But thank you very much for joining me, Chris, and we'll touch base later in the year.
My pleasure, Sarah.
Finally, we turn to business. 2023 saw several major pieces of regulation come into force, along with lots of new frameworks and industry groups. But we also saw a pushback against ESG from some corners. I have Dr. Ana Gonzalez-Hernandez on the phone to discuss what's on the cards for businesses in 2024. Ana is Director of Sustainability at Emerson, where she has been leading the company's net zero strategy and coordinating their ESG disclosures for the past 3 years. Ana, thank you for joining me.
Happy to join you on the show today.
Reflecting on 2023, what do you think was the biggest trend or challenge in sustainable business over the last year?
I think, as most sustainability professionals would know, I think it's a little hard to pick a few, but I'd say that in the topic of greenhouse gas emissions specifically, there's been a shift around the world, I think, towards Scope 3, so our value chain reporting. In our case, we started our journey in 2022 with our net zero value chain emissions that were set. So we've been calculating and modeling our Scope 3 emissions now for a number of years, which I think is what most companies have been doing. But I think initially a lot of the focus had been on driving actual tangible improvements in companies' own facilities, whereas now everyone is putting a lot more effort intentionally into engaging their value chain partners to build capacity in their supply chain, to help them improve their data, and sharing best practices, because at the end of the day, we all have to show progress across our entire value chains if we want to meet our targets. So I think that kind of Scope 3 and kind of outward focused efforts have been expanding over the past year for most companies. I think also there's been a shift towards thinking more about the impact that corporations have on biodiversity and vice versa, how biodiversity and nature impact our ability to do business in the future. And I think more broadly, the broadening of the scope of environmental strategies in companies. I think a lot of us started very focused on emissions and energy, perhaps looking at waste in our own operations too. And now we're exploring the relevance of other environmental aspects, such as water and biodiversity, which gets a lot more complicated, frankly. And I think the last thing maybe is the focus around the net zero commitments. I think, at least in our case, but I think for many companies, it's the same, and increasingly more so. We are focused on reductions at first, but we're having to get our heads around what carbon removal means and the options that are available out there for us, because even if it's something that we will have to be working on in the next couple of years, we do need to start making upfront commitments now to ensure that there's supply in the next couple of years. So I think most of us are now having to think through what our neutralization strategies may look like.
It sounds like, I mean, that shift from scope 1 and 2 to scope 3 and looking at broader nature challenges, along with the kind of offsetting question itself, it sounds like, it's getting more and more difficult, or these are bigger and broader and more complicated challenges. So what do you see as the key priorities going forward?
So I think I would like to focus on three things. I think going into a topic that you've discussed here before, related to disclosures. It's a very predictable and unsurprising topic, I think, for people in our field. But more specifically, the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is the first and I think most comprehensive version of this that companies are facing today. It brings non-financial reporting to the same auditable level as financial reporting, and it's a gargantuan task for most companies to even start thinking about how it's going to be implemented. I think in the case of CSRD too, the concept of double materiality is providing companies with a new perspective by forcing them to think about the impact in multiple directions, not just in terms of how ESG topics impact a company's financial performance, but also how a company impacts ESG. And I think, for my own sanity, maybe I've had to keep reminding myself about the end goal of these regulations and what they're trying to drive towards, and not the immediate task that we have at hand in the next 12 months to get ready for this reporting, which for us will be in 2026, given that we're not EU listed. I think thinking that the impact of these disclosure policies is really in how they will change how companies operate. They'll have to think about targets, actual strategies, and the hope is that even though the regulations are on communications and external reporting, it will have a ripple effect on how companies actually operate and how they think about their future and their role in this space. So I think these are really important, even though a lot of us are very frustrated with having to think about how we're going to implement them. And related to that, the second point, I think what CSRD and ESG disclosures in general are triggering to is an increased collaboration across departments. And I think within the sustainability profession, we've always known that sustainability is a cross-functional and transformational issue. But I think today we are starting to see that, partly thanks to these ESG broad regulations, sustainability is permeating other departments that maybe to date haven't been as impacted or engaged. Sustainability teams are now bigger and better integrated into organizations than they used to be even 2 years ago. But I think regulations are really pushing other departments like finance, internal audit, legal, IT, human resources, investor relations to really have to fly information if we want to succeed in this. And I'd say maybe the third and last topic would be touching on supply chain and being held accountable for our supply chain's ESG performance, which in a way relates back to disclosure again, because the EU is also forcing companies to report on their entire value chain efforts and not just our own, and to think about materiality across our entire value chain and not just our four walls. And I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, we have a lot of companies have started reporting on scope 3 emissions, but these have been based on models, on industry average data, which in some cases remain, not really representative of what your supply chain looks like. But also, as years pass and we have to all show progress on our targets, we have to really work with our suppliers to make sure we can capture their progress in our numbers. And so I think in 2024, there's going to be a lot more data exchange across value chains. I'm kind of hopeful that the data exchange will also not just be in one direction, where suppliers provide their customers with upstream emissions data, but that our customers also provide us as suppliers with their information, because at the end of the day, the targets cover both directions of our value chain, and the progress has to happen in both directions. And it's common to have customers requesting things of suppliers, but maybe the other way around is less common. So I think that data exchange, and I think across the board, I mean, I'm focusing on emissions here because it's, I think, where most companies are putting their efforts now, given their commitments. But I think it'll be across the board. There's going to be a lot more data exchange. At least I hope so.
And so what would a successful 2024 look like when it comes to corporate sustainability?
I think I'd probably say it's one where we're ready as organizations for the mandatory ESG disclosures that we have to comply with, where we set up the right data collection and reporting foundations, which will be a big challenge for many companies, and also the governance structures. I mean, ESG isn't a single bucket of topics, and so figuring out who is responsible for what is going to take time and thinking. I think it'll be one where on the supply chain front, we do start to be able to, as companies, broaden our ability to engage more and more suppliers, and do so in a more quantitative way, reflecting their progress in our reporting by collecting primary data for the first time. We continue to see progress in the decarbonization of electricity grids, which is an area that most companies rely on to make their progress, as well as progress in key materials like steel, aluminium, plastics, electronics, which a lot of companies use to build their products and consumers use in their daily lives. So I think really seeing emission reductions and overall sustainability progress in those energy and material sectors will be key in the next year.
Well, that touches nicely actually on what we covered earlier in the podcast on sort of policy progress in 2024 and industrial decarbonisation. So I also hope we get to see all those things coming over the next 12 months. Anna, thank you very much for joining me today and for sharing your insights from Emerson.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to all our guests and to you, the listeners, for tuning in to this episode. Please do subscribe on Spotify, SoundCloud, or on our website, and feel free to write to us at podcasts@oxfordeconomics.com. That's it for today on Greenomics from Oxford Economics, where we know that money might make the world go round, but sustainability makes it a much nicer place to live. See you next time.